Archie the cat says hi. Hey, everybody.
Has been said above, but in order to express particular thanks to Martinov for this excellent new formula, quote, the economic struggle of workers against the employers and the government. What a gem! With what inimitable skill and mastery in eliminating all partial disagreements and shades of differences among economists, this clear and concise proposition expresses the quintessence of economism, from summoning the workers, quote, to the political struggle, which they carry on in the general interest, for the improvements of the condition of all the workers, unquote, continuing through the theory of stages and ending in the resolution of the conference on the, quote, most widely applicable, etc. Quote, economic struggle against the government is precisely trade unionist politics, which is still very far from being social democratic politics. Section 3.2, how Martinov rendered Plekhanov more profound. Quote, what a large number of social democratic Lomonosovs have appeared among us lately, observed a comrade one day, having in mind the astonishing propensity of many who are inclined toward economism to arrive, quote, necessarily by their own understanding, at great truths, e.g. that the economic struggle stimulates the workers to ponder over their lack of rights, and in doing so to ignore, with the supreme contempt of born geniuses, all that has been produced by the antecedent development of revolutionary thought and of the revolutionary movement. Lomonosov Martinov is precisely such a born genius. We need but glance at his article, Urgent Questions, to see how by, quote, his own understanding, he arrives at what was said long ago by Axelrod, of whom our Lomonosov naturally says not a word. How, for instance, he is beginning to understand that we cannot ignore the opposition of such or such strata of the bourgeoisie. But alas, he is only arriving and is only beginning, not more than that, for so little has he understood Axelrod's ideas that he talks about, quote, the economic struggle against the employers and the government. For 3 years, Rabotchia Diello has tried hard to understand Axelrod, but has so far not understood him. Can one of the reasons be that social democracy, quote, like mankind, always sets itself only tasks that can be achieved? But the Lomonosovs are distinguished not only by their ignorance of many things, that would be but half misfortune, but also by their unawareness of their own ignorance. Now this is a real misfortune, and it is this misfortune that prompts them without further ado to attempt to render Plekhanov, quote, more profound. Much water, Lomonosov Martinov says, quote, has flowed under the bridge since Plekhanov wrote his book, Tasks of the Socialists in the Fight Against the Famine in Russia. The Social Democrats who for a decade led the economic struggle of the working class have failed as yet to lay down a broad theoretical basis for party tactics. This question has now come to a head, and if we should wish to lay down such a theoretical basis, we should certainly have to deepen considerably the principles of tactics developed at one time by Plekhanov. Our present definition of the distinction between propaganda and agitation would have to be different from Plekhanov's. Martinov has just quoted Plekhanov's words, quote, a propagandist presents many ideas to one or a few persons. An agitator presents only one or a few ideas, but he presents them to a mass of people. By propaganda, we would understand the revolutionary explanation of the present social system, entire or in its partial manifestations, whether that be done in a form intelligible to individuals or to broad masses. By agitation, in the strict sense of the word, we would understand the call upon the masses to undertake definite, concrete actions and the promotion of the direct revolutionary intervention of the proletariat in social life. We congratulate Russian and international social democracy on having found, thanks to Martinov, a new terminology, more strict and more profound. Hitherto we thought, with Plekhanov and with all the leaders of the international working class movement, that the propagandist, dealing with, say, the question of unemployment, must explain the capitalistic nature of crises, the cause of their inevitability in a modern society, the necessity for the transformation of this society into a socialist society, etc. In a word, he must present, quote, many ideas, so many, indeed, that they will be understood as an integral whole only by a comparatively few persons. The agitator, however, speaking on the same subject, will take as an illustration a fact that is most glaring and most widely known to his audience, say the death of an unemployed worker's family from starvation, the growing impoverishment, etc., and utilizing this fact, known to all, will direct his efforts to presenting a single idea to the masses, e.g., the senselessness of the contradiction between the increase of wealth and the increase of poverty. He will strive to rouse discontent and indignation among the masses against this crying injustice, leaving a more complete explanation of this contradiction to the propagandist. Consequently, the propagandist operates chiefly by means of the printed word, the agitator by means of the spoken word. The propagandist requires qualities quite different from those of the agitator. Kautsky and Lafargue, for example, we term propagandists. Bebel and Gizda we term agitators. To single out a third sphere or third function of practical activity, and to include in this function, quote, the call upon the masses to undertake definite concrete actions, is sheer nonsense, because the call as a single act either naturally and inevitably supplements the theoretical treatise, propagandist pamphlet, and agitational speech, or represents a purely executive function. Let us take, for example, the struggle the German Social Democrats are now waging against the corn duties. The theoreticians write research works on tariff policy with the call, say, to struggle for commercial treaties and for free trade. The propagandist does the same thing in the periodical press and the agitator in public speeches. At the present time, the, quote, concrete action of the masses takes the form of signing petitions to the Reichstag against raising the corn duties. The call for this action comes indirectly from the theoreticians, the propagandists, and the agitators, and directly from the workers who take the petition lists to the factories and to private homes for the gathering of signatures. According to the, quote, Martinov terminology, Kautsky and Bebel are both propagandists, while those who solicit the signatures are agitators. Isn't it clear? The German example recalled to my mind the German word, which, literally translated, means ball-horning. Johann Ballhorn, a Leipzig publisher of the 16th century, published a child's reader in which, as was the custom, he introduced a drawing of a cock, but a cock without spurs and with a couple of eggs lying near it. On the cover, he printed the legend, Revised Edition by Johann Ballhorn. Ever since then, the Germans describe any revision that is really a worsening as ballhorning. And one cannot help recalling Ballhorn upon seeing how the Martinovs try to render Plekhanov, quote, more profound. Why did our Lomonosov, quote, invent this confusion? In order to illustrate how Iskra devotes attention only to one side of the case, just as Plekhanov did a decade and a half ago. With Iskra, propagandist tasks force agitational tasks into the background, at least for the present. If we translate this last proposition from the language of Martinov into ordinary human language, because mankind has not yet managed to learn the newly invented terminology, we shall get the following. With Iskra, the tasks of political propaganda and political agitation force into the background the task of, quote, presenting to the government concrete demands for legislative and administrative measures that, quote, promise certain palpable results, or demands for social reforms, that is, if we are permitted once again to employ the old terminology of the old mankind not yet grown to Martinov's level. We suggest that the reader compare this thesis with the following tirade. Quote, what also astonishes us in these programs, the programs advanced by revolutionary social democrats, is their constant stress upon the benefit of workers' activity in parliament, non-existent in Russia, though they completely ignore, thanks to their revolutionary nihilism, the importance of workers' participation in the legislative manufacturers' assemblies on factory affairs, which do exist in Russia, or at least the importance of workers' participation in municipal bodies. The author of this tirade expresses in a somewhat more forthright and clearer manner the very idea which Lomonosov-Martinov discovered by his own understanding. The author is R.M. in the separate supplement to Rabotchaya Missal. 3.3. Political exposures and training in revolutionary activity. In advancing against Iskra his theory of, quote, raising the activity of the working masses, Martynov actually betrayed an urge to belittle that activity, for he declared the very economic struggle before which all economists grovel to be the preferable, particularly important, and, quote, most widely applicable means of rousing this activity and its broadest field. This error is characteristic precisely in that it is by no means peculiar to Martynov. In reality, it is possible to, quote, raise the activity of the working masses only when this activity is not restricted to, quote, political agitation on an economic basis. A basic condition for the necessary expansion of political agitation is the organization of comprehensive political exposure. In no way, except by means of such exposures, can the masses be trained in political consciousness and revolutionary activity. Hence, activity of this kind is one of the most important functions of international social democracy as a whole, for even political freedom does not in any way eliminate exposures. It merely shifts somewhat their sphere of direction. Thus, the German party is especially strengthening its positions and spreading its influence, thanks particularly to the untiring energy with which it is conducting its campaign of political exposure. Working class consciousness cannot be genuine political consciousness unless the workers are trained to respond to all cases of tyranny, oppression, violence, and abuse, no matter what class is affected, unless they are trained, moreover, to respond from a social democratic point of view and no other. The consciousness of the working masses cannot be genuine class consciousness unless the workers learn from concrete, and above all from topical, political facts and events to observe every other social class in all the manifestations of its intellectual, ethical, and political life, unless they learn to apply in practice the materialist analysis and the materialist estimate of all aspects of the life and activity of all classes, strata, and groups of the population. Those who concentrate the attention, observation, and consciousness of the working class exclusively, or even mainly, upon itself alone are not social democrats, for the self-knowledge of the working class is indissolubly bound up, not solely with a fully clear theoretical understanding, or rather not so much with the theoretical as with the practical understanding, of the relationships between all the various classes of modern society acquired through the experience of political life. For this reason, the conception of the political struggle as the most widely applicable means of drawing the masses into the political movement, which our economists preach, is so extremely harmful and reactionary in its practical significance. In order to become a social democrat, the worker must have a clear picture in his mind of the economic nature and the social and political features of the landlord and the priest, the high state official and the peasant, the student and the vagabond. He must know their strong and weak points. He must grasp the meaning of all the catchwords and sophisms by which each class and each stratum camouflages its selfish strivings and its real inner workings. He must understand what interests are reflected by certain institutions and certain laws and how they are reflected. But this clear picture cannot be obtained from any book. It can be obtained only from living examples and from exposures that follow close upon what is going on about us at a given moment, upon what is being discussed, in whispers perhaps, by each one in his own way, upon what finds expression in such and such events, in such and such statistics, in such and such court sentences, etc., etc. These comprehensive political exposures are an essential and fundamental condition for training the masses in revolutionary activity. Why do the Russian workers still manifest little revolutionary activity in response to the brutal treatment of the people by the police, the persecution of religious sects, the flogging of peasants, the outrageous censorship, the torture of soldiers, the persecution of the most innocent cultural undertakings, etc.? Is it because the, quote, economic struggle does not, quote, stimulate them to this? Because such activity does not, quote, promise palpable results? Because it produces little that is positive? To adopt such an opinion, we repeat, is merely to direct the charge where it does not belong, to blame the working masses for one's own Philistinism or Bernsteinism. We must blame ourselves, our lagging behind the mass movement, for still being unable to organize sufficiently wide, striking, and rapid exposures of all the shameful outrages. When we do that, and we must and can do it, the most backward worker will understand, or will feel, that the students and religious sects, the peasants and the authors are being abused and outraged by those same dark forces that are oppressing and crushing him at every step of his life. Feeling that, he himself will be filled with an irresistible desire to react, and he will know how to hoot the censors one day, on another day to demonstrate outside the house of a governor who has brutally suppressed a peasant uprising, on still another day to teach a lesson to the gendarmes and surplices who are doing the work of the Holy Inquisition, etc. As yet, we have done very little, almost nothing, to bring before the working masses prompt exposures on all possible issues. Many of us as yet do not recognize this as our bounden duty, but trail spontaneously in the wake of, quote, drab everyday struggle in the narrow confines of factory life. Under such circumstances, to say that, quote, Iskra displays a tendency to minimize the significance of the forward march of the drab everyday struggle in comparison with the propaganda of brilliant and complete ideas, means to drag the party back, to defend and glorify our unpreparedness and backwardness. As for calling the masses to action, that will come of itself as soon as energetic political agitation, live and striking exposures come into play. To catch some criminal red-handed and immediately to brand him publicly in all places is of itself far more effective than any number of calls. The effect very often is such as will make it impossible to tell exactly who it was that called upon the masses and who suggested this or that plan of demonstration, etc. Calls for action, not in the general but in the concrete sense of the term, can be made only at the place of action. Only those who themselves go into action and do so immediately can sound such calls. Our business as social democratic publicists is to deepen, expand, and intensify political exposures and political agitation. A word in passing about, quote, calls to action. The only newspaper which prior to the spring events called upon the workers to intervene actively in a matter that certainly did not promise any palpable results whatsoever for the workers, i.e. the drafting of the students into the Army, was Iskra. Immediately after the publication of the order of January 11 on, quote, drafting the 183 students into the Army, Iskra published an article on the matter in its February issue, number 2, and before any demonstration was begun, forthwith called upon, quote, the workers to go to the aid of the students, called upon the people openly to take up the government's arrogant challenge. We ask, how is the remarkable fact to be explained that although Martynov talks so much about calls to action, and even suggests calls to action as a special form of activity, that he said not a word about this call? After this, was it not sheer Philistinism on Martynov's part to allege that Iskra was one-sided because it did not issue sufficient calls to struggle for demands, quote, promising palpable results? Our economists, including Roboche Diello, were successful because they adapted themselves to the backward workers. But the social democratic worker, the revolutionary worker, and the number of such workers is growing, will indignantly reject all this talk about struggle for demands, quote, promising palpable results, etc., because he will understand that this is only a variation of the old song about adding a kopeck to the ruble. Such a worker will say to his counselors from Roboche Missile and Roboche Diello, you are busying yourselves in vain, gentlemen, and shirking your proper duties by meddling with such excessive zeal in a job that we can very well manage ourselves. There is nothing clever in your assertion that the Social Democrats' task is to lend the economic struggle itself a political character. That is only the beginning. It is not the main task of the Social Democrats. For all over the world, including Russia, the police themselves often take the initiative in lending the economic struggle a political character, and the workers themselves learn to understand whom the government supports. The, quote, economic struggle of the workers against the employers and the government, about which you make as much fuss as if you had discovered a new America, is being waged in all parts of Russia, even the most remote, by the workers themselves who have heard about strikes, but who have heard almost nothing about socialism. The, quote, activity you want to stimulate among us workers by advancing concrete demands that promise palpable results, we are already displaying, and in our everyday limited trade union work we put forward these concrete demands, very often without any assistance whatsoever from the intellectuals. But such activity is not enough for us. We are not children to be fed on the thin gruel of economic politics alone. We want to know everything that others know. We want to learn the details of all aspects of political life and to take part actively in every single political event. In order that we may do this, the intellectuals must talk to us less of what we already know and tell us more about what we do not yet know, and what we can never learn from our factory and economic experience, namely political knowledge. You intellectuals can acquire this knowledge, and it is your duty to bring it to us in 100 and 1,000-fold greater measure than you have done up to now. And you must bring it to us, not only in the form of discussions, pamphlets, and articles, which very often, pardon our frankness, are rather dull, but precisely in the form of vivid exposures of what our government and our governing classes are doing at this very moment in all spheres of life. Devote more zeal to carrying out this duty and talk less about, quote, raising the activity of the working masses. We are far more active than you think, and we are quite able to support, by open street fighting, even demands that do not promise any, quote, palpable results whatsoever. It is not for you to raise our activity, because activity is precisely the thing that you yourselves lack. Bow less in subservience to spontaneity and think more about raising your own activity, gentlemen. 3.4. What is there in common between economism and terrorism? In the last footnote, we cited the opinion of an economist and of a non-social democratic terrorist who showed themselves to be accidentally in agreement. Generally speaking, however, there is not an accidental but a necessary inherent connection between the two, of which we shall have need to speak later, and which must be mentioned here in connection with the question of education for revolutionary activity. The economists and the root, namely subservience to spontaneity, with which we dealt in the preceding chapter as a general phenomenon, and which we shall now examine in relation to its effect upon political activity in the political struggle. At first sight, our assertion may seem paradoxical, so great is the difference between those who stress the, quote, drab everyday struggle, and those who call for the most self-sacrificing struggle of individuals. But this is no paradox. The economists and the terrorists merely bow to different poles of spontaneity. The economists bow to the spontaneity of, quote, the labor movement pure and simple, while the terrorists bow to the spontaneity of the passionate indignation of intellectuals who lack the ability or opportunity to connect the revolutionary struggle and the working class movement into an integral whole. It is difficult indeed for those who have lost their belief, or who have never believed, that this is possible, to find some outlet for their indignation and revolutionary energy other than terror. Thus, both forms of subservience to spontaneity we have mentioned are nothing but the beginnings of the implementation of the notorious Credo program. Let the workers wage their, quote, economic struggle against the employers and the government. We apologize to the author of the Credo for expressing her views in Martinov's words. We think we have a right to do so, since the Credo, too, says that in the economic struggle, the workers, quote, come up against the political regime and let the intellectuals conduct the political struggle by their own efforts, with the aid of terror, of course. This is an absolutely logical and inevitable conclusion which must be insisted on, even though those who are beginning to carry out this program do not themselves realize that it is inevitable. Political activity has its logic quite apart from the consciousness of those who, with the best intentions, call either for terror or for lending the economic struggle itself a political character. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, and, in this case, good intentions cannot save one from being spontaneously drawn, quote, along the line of least resistance, along the line of the purely bourgeois Credo program. Surely it is no accident that either many Russian liberals, avowed liberals and liberals that wear the mask of Marxism, wholeheartedly sympathize with terror and try to foster the terrorist moods that have surged up in the present time. The formation of the Revolutionary Socialists' Svoboda Group, which set itself the aim of helping the working class movement in every possible way, but which included in its program terror and emancipation, so to speak, from social democracy, once again confirmed the remarkable perspicacity of P.B. Axelrod, who literally foretold these results of social democratic waverings as far back as the end of 1897 in Present Tasks and Tactics, when he outlined his famous two perspectives. All the subsequent disputes and disagreements among Russian social democrats are contained, like a plant in the seed, in these two perspectives. From this point of view, it also becomes clear why Raboccia Diello, unable to withstand the spontaneity of economism, has likewise been unable to withstand the spontaneity of terrorism. It is highly interesting to note here the specific arguments that Svoboda has advanced in defense of terrorism. It, quote, completely denies the deterrent role of terrorism, but instead stresses its, quote, excitative significance. This is characteristic, first, as representing one of the stages of the breakup and decline of the traditional, pre-social democratic cycle of ideas which insisted upon terrorism. The admission that the government cannot now be terrified and hence disrupted by terror is tantamount to a complete condemnation of terror as a system of struggle, as a sphere of activity sanctioned by the program. Secondly, it is still more characteristic as an example of the failure to understand our immediate tasks in regard to, quote, education for revolutionary activity. Svoboda advocates terror as a means of, quote, exciting the working class movement and of giving it a strong impetus. It is difficult to imagine an argument that more thoroughly disproves itself. Are there not enough outrages committed in Russian life without special excitants having to be invented? On the other hand, is it not obvious that those who are not and cannot be roused to excitement even by Russian tyranny will stand by twiddling their thumbs and watch a handful of terrorists engaged in single combat with the government? The fact is that the working masses are roused to a high pitch of excitement by the social evils in Russian life, but we are unable to gather, if one may so put it, and concentrate all these drops and streamlets of popular resentment that are brought forth to a far larger extent than we imagine by the conditions of Russian life, and that must be combined into a single gigantic torrent. That this can be accomplished is irrefutably proved by the enormous growth of the working class movement and the eagerness, noted above, with which the workers clamor for political literature. On the other hand, calls for terror and calls to lend the economic struggle itself a political character are merely two different forms of evading the most pressing duty now resting upon Russian revolutionaries, namely, the organization of comprehensive political agitation. Svoboda desires to substitute terror for agitation, openly admitting that, quote, as soon as intensified and strenuous agitation has begun among the masses, the excitative function of terror will be ended. This proves precisely that both the terrorists and the economists underestimate the revolutionary activity of the masses, despite the striking evidence of the events that took place in the spring, and whereas the one group goes out in search of artificial excitants, the other talks about concrete demands. But both fail to devote sufficient attention to the development of their own activity in political agitation and in the organization of political exposures, and no other work can serve as a substitute for this task, either at the present time or at any other. Section 3.5, the working class as vanguard fighter for democracy. We have seen that the conduct of the broadest political agitation, and consequently of all-sided political exposures, is an absolutely necessary and a paramount task of our activity, if this activity is to be truly social democratic. However, we arrived at this conclusion solely on the grounds of the pressing needs of the working class for political knowledge and political training. But such a presentation of the question is too narrow, for it ignores the general democratic tasks of social democracy, in particular of present-day Russian social democracy. In order to explain the point more concretely, we shall approach the subject from an aspect that is, quote, nearest to the economist, namely from the practical aspect. Quote, everyone agrees that it is necessary to develop the political consciousness of the working class. The question is how that is to be done and what is required to do it. The economic struggle merely, quote, impels the workers to realize the government's attitude toward the working class. Consequently, however much we may try to, quote, lend the economic struggle itself a political character, we shall never be able to develop the political consciousness of the workers to the level of social democratic political consciousness by keeping within the framework of the economic struggle, for that framework is too narrow. The Martynov formula has some value for us, not because it illustrates Martynov's aptitude for confusing things, but because it pointedly expresses the basic error that all the economists commit, namely, their conviction that it is possible to develop the class political consciousness of the workers from within, so to speak, from their economic struggle, i.e. by making this struggle the exclusive, or at least the main, starting point, by making it the exclusive, or at least the main, basis. Such a view is radically wrong. Piqued by our polemics against them, the economists refuse to ponder deeply over the origins of these disagreements, with the result that we simply cannot understand one another. It is as if we spoke in different tongues. Class political consciousness can be brought to the workers only from without, that is, only from outside the economic struggle, from outside the sphere of relations between workers and employers. The sphere from which alone it is possible to obtain this knowledge is the sphere of relationships of all classes and strata to the state and government, the sphere of the interrelations between all classes. For that reason, the reply to the question as to what must be done to bring political knowledge to the workers cannot merely be the answer with which, in the majority of cases, the practical workers, especially those inclined towards economism, mostly content themselves, namely, quote, to go among the workers. To bring political knowledge to the workers, the Social Democrats must go among all classes of the population. They must dispatch units of their army in all directions. We deliberately select this blunt formula. We deliberately express ourselves in this sharply simplified manner, not because we desire to indulge in paradoxes, but in order to impel the economists to a realization of their tasks which they unpardonably ignore, to suggest to them strongly the difference between trade unionist and social democratic politics which they refuse to understand. We therefore beg the reader not to get wrought up, but to hear us patiently to the end. Let us take the type of social democratic study circle that has become most widespread in the past few years and examine its work. It has, quote, contacts with the workers, and rests content with this, issuing leaflets in which the abuses in the factories, the government's partiality towards the capitalists, and the tyranny of the police are strongly condemned. At workers' meetings, the discussions never, or rarely ever, go beyond the limits of these subjects. Extremely rare are the lectures and discussions held on the history of the revolutionary movement, on questions of the government's home and foreign policy, on questions of the economic evolution of Russia and Europe, on the position of the various classes in modern society, etc. As to systematically acquiring and extending contact with other classes of society, no one even dreams of that. In fact, the ideal leader, as the majority of the members of such circles picture him, is something far more in the nature of a trade union secretary than a socialist political leader. For the secretary of any, say, English trade union always helps the workers to carry on the economic struggle. He helps them to expose factory abuses, explains the injustices of the laws and of measures that hamper the freedom to strike and to picket, i.e. to warn all and sundry that a strike is proceeding at a certain factory, explains the partiality of arbitration court judges who belong to the bourgeois classes, etc., etc. In a word, every trade union secretary conducts and helps to conduct, quote, the economic struggle against the employers and the government. It cannot be too strongly maintained, not social democracy, that the Social Democrats' idea, but the tribune of the people, tyranny and oppression, no matter where it appears, no matter the people it affects, who is able to generalize all these manifestations and produce a single picture of police violence and capitalist exploitation, who is able to take advantage of every event, however small, in order to set forth before all his socialist convictions and his democratic demands, in order to clarify for all and everyone the world historic significance of the struggle for the emancipation of the proletariat. Compare, for example, a leader like Robert Knight, the well-known secretary and leader of the Boilermakers trade unions in England, with Wilhelm Liebknecht, and try to apply to them the contrasts that Martinov draws in his controversy with Piskra. You will see, I am running through Martinov's article, that Robert Knight engaged in more in, quote, calling the masses to certain concrete acts, while Liebknecht engaged more in, quote, the revolutionary elucidation of the whole of the present system or partial manifestations of it. That Robert Knight, quote, formulated the immediate demands of the proletariat and indicated the means by which they can be achieved, whereas Liebknecht, while doing this, did not hold back from, quote, simultaneously guiding the activity of various opposition strata dictating a positive program of action for them. That Robert Knight strove, quote, as far as possible to lend the economic struggle itself a political character, and was excellently able, quote, to submit to the government concrete demands promising, whereas Liebknecht engaged to a much greater degree in, quote, one-sided exposures. That Robert Knight attached more significance to the, quote, forward march of the drab everyday struggle, whereas Liebknecht attached more significance to, quote, the propaganda of brilliant and completed ideas. That Liebknecht converted the paper he was directing into, quote, an organ of revolutionary opposition that exposed the state of affairs in our country, particularly the political state of affairs, insofar as it affected the interest of the most varied strata of the population, whereas Robert Knight, quote, worked for the cause of the working class in close organic connection with the proletarian struggle. If by close and organic connection is meant the subservience to spontaneity which we examined above. By taking the examples of Krzyzewski and Martynov and the sphere of his influence, convinced of, as is Martynov, that, quote, by doing so he deepened that influence. In a word, you will see that de facto, Martynov reduces social democracy to the level of trade unionism, though he does so, of course, not because he does not desire the good of democracy, but simply because he is a little too much in a hurry to render Plekhanov more profound instead of taking trouble to understand him. Let us return, however, to our theses. We said that a social democrat, if he really believes it necessary to develop comprehensively the political consciousness of the proletariat, must, quote, go among all classes of the population. This gives rise to the questions, how is this to be done? Have we enough forces to do this? Is there a basis for such work among all the other classes? Will this not mean a retreat or lead to a retreat from the class point of view? Let us deal with these questions. We must go among all classes of the population as theoreticians, as propagandists, as agitators, and as organizers. No one doubts that the theoretical work of social democrats should aim at studying all the specific features of the social and political condition of the various classes. But extremely little is done in this direction as compared with the work that is done in studying the specific features of factory life. In the committees and study circles, one can meet people who are immersed in the study even of some special branch of the metal industry, but one can hardly ever find members of organizations, obliged, as often happens for some reason or other, to give up practical work, who are especially engaged in gathering material on some pressing question of social and political life in our country, which could serve as a means for conducting social democratic work among other strata of the population. In dwelling upon the fact that the majority of the present-day leaders of the working class movement lack training, we cannot refrain from mentioning training in this respect also, for it too is bound up with the economist conception of, quote, close organic connection with the proletarian struggle. The principal thing, of course, is propaganda and agitation among all strata of the people. The work of the West European Social Democrat is, in this respect, facilitated by the public meetings and rallies which all are free to attend, and by the fact that in Parliament he addresses the representatives of all classes. We have neither a parliament nor freedom of assembly. Nevertheless, we are able to arrange meetings of workers who desire to listen to a social democrat. We must also find ways and means of calling meetings of representatives of all social classes that desire to listen to a democrat. For he is no social democrat who forgets in practice that, quote, the communists support every revolutionary movement. That we are obliged for that round and emphasize general democratic tasks before the whole people, but for a moment concealing our socialist convictions. He is no social democrat who forgets in practice his obligation to be ahead of all in raising, accentuating, and solving every general democratic question. Quote, but everyone agrees with this, the impatient reader will exclaim, and the new instructions adopted by the last conference of the Union Abroad for the editorial board of Rabotchi say, quote, all events of social and political life that affect the proletariat either directly as a special class or as the vanguard of all the revolutionary forces in the struggle for freedom, should serve as subjects for political propaganda and agitation, unquote. Yes, these are very true and very good words, and we would be fully satisfied if Rabotchi-Diello understood them, and if it refrained from saying in the next breath things that contradict them. For it is not enough to call ourselves the vanguard, the advanced contingent. We must act in a way that all the other contingents recognize and are obliged to admit that we are marching in the vanguard. And we ask the reader, are the representatives of the other contingents such fools as to take our word for it when we say that we are the vanguard? Just picture to yourselves the following. A social democrat comes to the contingent of Russian-educated radicals or liberal constitutionalists and says, we are the vanguard. The task confronting us now is, as far as possible, to lend the economic struggle itself a political character. The radical or constitutionalist, if he is at all intelligent, and there are many intelligent men among Russian radicals and constitutionalists, would only smile at such a speech and would say, to himself, of course, in the majority of cases he is an experienced diplomat, your vanguard must be made up of simpletons. They do not even understand that it is our task, the task of the progressive representatives of bourgeois democracy, to lend the workers' economic struggle itself a political character. While we too, like the West European bourgeois, want to draw the workers into politics, but only into trade unionists, not into social democratic politics. Trade unionist politics of the working class is precisely bourgeois politics of the working class, and this vanguard's formulation of it is the formulation of trade unionist politics. Let them call themselves social democrats to their heart's content. I am not a child to get excited over a label. But they must not fall under the influence of those pernicious orthodox doctrinaires. Let them allow freedom of criticism to those who unconsciously are driving social democracy into trade unionist channels. And the faint smile of our constitutionalist will turn into Homeric laughter when he learns that the social democrats who talk of social democracy as the vanguard today, when spontaneity almost completely dominates our movement, fear nothing so much as, quote, belittling the spontaneous element, as, quote, underestimating the significance of the forward movement of the drab everyday struggle as compared with the propaganda of brilliant and completed ideas, etc., etc. A vanguard which fears that consciousness will outstrip spontaneity, which fears to put forward a bold plan that would compel general recognition even among those who differ with us. Are they not confusing vanguard with rearguard? Indeed, let us examine the following piece of reasoning by Martynov. On page 40, he says that Iskra is one-sided in its tactics of exposing abuses. That, quote, however much we may spread distrust and hatred of the government, we shall not achieve our aim until we have succeeded in developing sufficient active social energy for its overthrow, unquote. This, it may be said parenthetically, is the familiar solicitude for the activation of the masses with a simultaneous striving to restrict one's own activity. But that is not the main point at the moment. Martynov speaks here accordingly of revolutionary energy, quote, for overthrowing. And what conclusion does he arrive at? Since in ordinary times various social strata inevitably march separately, quote, it is therefore clear that we social democrats cannot simultaneously guide the activities of various opposition strata. We cannot dictate to them a positive program of action. We cannot point out to them in what manner they should wage a day-to-day struggle for their interests. The liberal strata will themselves take care of the active struggle for their immediate interests, the struggle that will bring them face to face with our political regime, unquote. Thus, having begun with talk about revolutionary energy, about the active struggle for the overthrow of the autocracy, Martynov immediately turns toward trade union energy and active struggle for immediate interests. It goes without saying that we cannot guide the struggles of the students, liberals, etc. for their, quote, immediate interests, but this was not the point at issue, most worthy economist. The point we were discussing was the possible and necessary participation of various social strata in the overthrow of the autocracy. And not only are we able, but it is our bounden duty to guide these, quote, activity of the various opposition strata, unquote, if we desire to be the vanguard. Not only will our students and liberals, etc., themselves take care of, quote, the struggle that brings them face to face with our political regime, unquote. The police and the officials of the autocratic government will see to this first and foremost. But if we desire to be front-rank Democrats, we must make it our concern to direct the thoughts of those who are dissatisfied only with conditions at the university, or only in the Zemstvo, etc., to the idea that the entire political system is worthless. We must take upon ourselves the task of organizing an all-around political struggle under the leadership of our party in such a manner as to make it possible for all oppositional strata to render their fullest support to the struggle and to our party. We must train our social democratic practical workers to become political leaders, able to guide all the manifestations of this all-around struggle, able at the right time to, quote, dictate a positive program of action, unquote, for the aroused students, the discontented Zemstvo people, the incensed religious sects, the offended elementary school teachers, etc., etc. For that reason, Martinov's assertion that, quote, with regard to these, we can function merely in the negative role of exposers of abuses, we can only dissipate their hopes in various government commissions, unquote, is completely false. By saying this, Martinov shows that he absolutely fails to understand the role that the revolutionary vanguard must really play. If the reader bears this in mind, he will be clear as to the real meaning of Martinov's concluding remarks. Quote, Iskra is the organ of the revolutionary opposition which exposes the state of affairs in our country, particularly the political state of affairs, insofar as it affects the interests of the most varied strata of the population. We, however, work and will continue to work for the cause of the working class in close organic contact with the proletarian struggle. By restricting the sphere of our active influence, we deepen that influence, unquote. The true sense of this conclusion is as follows. Iskra desires to elevate the trade unionist politics of the working class, to which through misconception, through lack of training, or through conviction, our practical workers frequently confine themselves to the level of social democratic politics. Rabotchia Dielo, however, desires to degrade social democratic politics to trade unionist politics. Moreover, it assures the world that the two positions are, quote, entirely compatible within the common cause, unquote. O sancta simplicitas. To proceed, have we sufficient forces to direct our propaganda and agitation among all social classes? Most certainly. Our economists, who are frequently inclined to deny this, lose sight of the gigantic progress our movement has made from approximately 1894 to 1901. Like real tail enders, they often go on living in the bygone stages of the movement's inception. In the earlier period, indeed, we had astonishingly few forces, and it was perfectly natural and legitimate then to devote ourselves exclusively to activities among the workers and to condemn severely any deviation from this course. The entire task then was to consolidate our position in the working class. At the present time, however, gigantic forces have been attracted to the movement. The best representatives of the younger generation of the educated classes are coming over to us. Everywhere in the provinces there are people, resident there by dint of circumstance, who have taken part in the movement in the past or who desire to do so now, and who are gravitating towards social democracy, whereas in 1894 one could count the Social Democrats on the fingers of one's hand. A basic political and organizational shortcoming of our movement is our inability to utilize all these forces and give them appropriate work. We shall deal with this more fully in the next chapter. The overwhelming majority of these forces entirely lack the opportunity of, quote, going among the workers, so that there are no grounds for fearing that we shall divert forces from our main work. In order to be able to provide the workers with real, comprehensive, and live political knowledge, we must have, quote, our own people, social democrats, everywhere, among all social strata, and in positions from which we can learn the inner springs of our state mechanism. Such people are required, not only for propaganda and agitation, but in a still larger measure for organization. Is there a basis for activity among all classes of the population? Whoever doubts this lags in his consciousness behind the spontaneous awakening of the masses. The working class movement has aroused and is continuing to arouse discontent in some, hopes of support for the opposition in others, and in still others the realization that the autocracy is unbearable and must inevitably fall. We would be politicians and social democrats in name only, as all too often happens in reality, if we failed to realize that our task is to utilize every manifestation of discontent and to gather and turn to the best account every protest, however small. This is quite apart from the fact that the millions of the laboring peasantry, handicraftsmen, petty artisans, etc., would always listen eagerly to the speech of any social democrat who is at all qualified. Indeed, is there a single social class in which there are no individuals, groups, or circles that are discontented with the lack of rights and with tyranny, and therefore accessible to the propaganda of social democrats as the spokesman of the most pressing general democratic needs? To those who desire to have a clear idea of what the political agitation of a social democrat among all classes and strata of the population should be like, we would point to political exposures in the broad sense of the word as the principal, but of course not the sole, form of this agitation. Quote, "We must arouse in every section of the population that is at all politically conscious a passion for political exposure," unquote, I wrote in my article Where to Begin, Iskra, May 1901, with which I shall deal in greater detail later. Quote, "We must not be discouraged by the fact that the voice of political exposure is today so feeble, timid, and infrequent. This is not because of a wholesale submission to police despotism, but because those who are able and ready to make exposures have no tribune from which to speak, no eager and encouraging audience. They do not see anywhere among the people that force to which it would be worthwhile directing their complaint against the omnipotent Russian government. We are now in a position to provide a tribune for the nationwide exposure of the Tsarist government, and it is our duty to do this. That tribune must be a social democratic newspaper," unquote. The ideal audience for political exposure is the working class, which is first and foremost in need of all-around and live political knowledge, and is most capable of converting this knowledge into active struggle, even when that struggle does not promise, quote, "palpable results." A tribune for nationwide exposures can be only an all-Russian newspaper. Quote, "Without a political organ, a political movement deserving that name is inconceivable in the Europe of today. In this respect, Russia must undoubtedly be included in present-day Europe. The press long ago became a power in our country, otherwise the government would not spend tens of thousands of rubles to bribe it and to subsidize the Katkovs and the Mishcherskis. It is no novelty in autocratic Russia for the underground press to break through the wall of censorship and compel the legal and conservative press to speak openly of it. This was the case in the 70s and even in the 50s. How much broader and deeper are now the sections of the people willing to read the illegal underground press and to learn from it, quote, how to live and how to die, unquote, to use the expression of a worker who sent a letter to Iskra. Political exposures are as much a declaration of war against the government as economic exposures are a declaration of war against the factory owners. The moral significance of this declaration of war will be all the greater, the wider, and the more powerful the campaign of exposure will be, and the more numerous and determined the social class that has declared war in order to begin the war. Hence, political exposures in themselves serve as a powerful instrument for disintegrating the system we oppose, as a means for diverting from the enemy his casual or temporary allies, as a means for spreading hostility and distrust among the permanent partners of the autocracy. In our time, only a party that will organize really nationwide exposures can become the vanguard of the revolutionary forces. The word nationwide has a very profound meaning. The overwhelming majority of the non-working class exposers. Be it remembered that in order to become the vanguard, we must attract other classes, are sober politicians and level-headed men of affairs. They know perfectly well how dangerous it is to complain against even a minor official, let alone against the omnipotent Russian government. And they will come to us with their complaints only when they see that these complaints can really have effect, and that we represent a political force. In order to become such a force in the eyes of outsiders, much persistent and stubborn work is required to raise our own consciousness, initiative, and energy. To accomplish this, it is not really enough to attach a vanguard label to rearguard theory and practice. But if we have to undertake the organization of a really nationwide exposure of the government, in what way will then the class character of our movement be expressed? The overzealous advocate of, quote, close organic contact with the proletarian struggle, unquote, will ask us, as indeed he does. The reply is manifold. We Social Democrats will organize these nationwide exposures. All questions raised by the agitation will be explained in a consistently social democratic spirit, without any concessions to deliberate or undeliberate distortions of Marxism. The all-round political agitation will be conducted by a party which unites into one inseparable whole, the assault on the government in the name of the entire people, the revolutionary training of the proletariat, and the safeguarding of its political independence, the guidance of the economic struggle of the working class, and the utilization of all its spontaneous conflicts with its exploiters, which rouse and bring into our camp increasing numbers of the proletariat. But a most basic characteristic feature of economism is its failure to understand this connection, more, this identity of the most pressing need of the proletariat, a comprehensive political education through the medium of political agitation and political exposures, with the need of the general democratic movement. This lack of understanding is expressed not only in Martinovite phrases, but in the references to a supposedly class point of view identical in meaning with these phrases. Thus, the authors of the Economist letter in Iskra number 12 state, quote, "This basic drawback of Iskra, overestimation of ideology, is also the cause of its inconsistency on the question of the attitude of social democracy to the various social classes and tendencies, by theoretical reasoning, not by, quote, the growth of party tasks which grow together with the party. Iskra solved the problem of the immediate transition to the struggle against absolutism. In all probability, it senses the difficulty of such a task for the workers under the present state of affairs, not only senses, but knows full well that this task appears less difficult to the workers than to the economist intellectuals with their nursemaid concern, for the workers are prepared to fight even for demands which, to use the language of the never-to-be-forgotten Martinov, do not, quote, promise palpable results, but lacking the patience to wait until the workers will have gathered sufficient forces for this struggle, Iskra begins to seek allies in the ranks of the liberals and intellectuals, unquote. Yes, we have indeed lost all, quote, patience, quote, waiting for the blessed time, long promised us by diverse, quote, conciliators, when the economists will have stopped charging the workers with their own backwardness and justifying their own lack of energy with allegations that the workers lack strength. We must ask our economists, what do they mean by, quote, the gathering of working class strength for the struggle? Is it not evident that this means the political training of the workers so that all the aspects of our vile autocracy are revealed to them? And is it not clear that precisely for this work, we need, quote, allies in the ranks of the liberals and intellectuals, who are prepared to join us in the exposure of the political attack on the Zemstvos, on the teachers, on the statisticians, on the students, etc.? Is this surprisingly, quote, intricate mechanism really so difficult to understand? Has not P.B. Axelrod constantly repeated since 1897 that, quote, the task before the Russian Social Democrats of acquiring adherents and direct and indirect allies among the non-proletarian classes will be solved principally and primarily by the character of the propagandist activities conducted among the proletariat itself, unquote. But the Martinovs and the other economists continue to imagine that, quote, by economic struggle against the employers and the government, the workers must first gather strength for trade unionist policies and then, quote, go over, we presume, from trade unionist, quote, training for activity to social democratic activity. Quote, in this quest, continue the economists, Iskra not infrequently departs from the class point of view, obscures class antagonisms, and puts into the forefront the common nature of the discontent with the government, although the causes and the degree of the discontent vary considerably among the, quote, allies. Such, for example, is Iskra's attitude towards the Zemstvo. Iskra, it is alleged, quote, promises the nobles that are dissatisfied with the government's sops the assistance of the working class, but it doesn't say a word about the class antagonism that exists between these social strata, unquote. If the reader will turn to the article, The Autocracy and the Zemstvo, issues 2 and 4 of Iskra, to which in all probability the authors of the letter refer, he will find that they deal with the attitude of government towards the, quote, mild agitation of the bureaucratic Zemstvo, which is based on the social estates, and toward the, quote, independent activity of even the propertied classes. The article states that the workers cannot look on indifferently while the government is waging a struggle against the Zemstvo, and the Zemstvos are called upon to stop making mild speeches and to speak firmly and resolutely when revolutionary social democracy confronts the government in all its strength. What the authors of the letter do not agree with here is not clear. Do they think that the workers will, quote, not understand the phrases, quote, propertied classes and, quote, bureaucratic Zemstvo based on the social estates? Do they think that urging the Zemstvo to abandon mild speeches and to speak firmly is, quote, overestimating ideology? Do they imagine the workers can, quote, gather strength for the struggle against the autocracy if they know nothing about the attitude of the autocracy toward the Zemstvo as well? All this too remains unknown. One thing alone is clear, and that is that the authors of the letter have a very vague idea of what the political tasks of social democracy are. This is revealed still more clearly by their remark, quote, such too is Iskra's attitude towards the student movement, unquote, i.e. it also, quote, obscures the class antagonisms. Instead of calling on the workers to declare by means of public demonstrations that the real breeding place of unbridled violence and disorder and outrage is not the university youth but the Russian government, we ought probably to have inserted arguments in the spirit of Rabochia Missile. Such ideas were expressed by Social Democrats in the autumn of 1901, after the events of February and March, on the eve of a fresh upsurge of the student movement, which reveals that even in this sphere, the, quote, spontaneous protest against the autocracy is outstripping the conscious social democratic leadership of the movement. The spontaneous striving of the workers to defend the students who are being assaulted by the police and the Cossacks surpasses the conscious activity of the social democratic organization. Quote, and yet in other articles, continue the authors of the letter, Iskra sharply condemns all compromise and defends, for example, the intolerant conduct of the Gestists, unquote. We would advise those who are wont so conceitedly and frivolously to declare that the present disagreements among the Social Democrats are unessential and do not justify a split, to ponder these words. Is it possible for people to work together in the same organization when some of them contend that we have done extremely little to explain the hostility of the autocracy to the various classes and to inform the workers of the opposition displayed by the various social strata to the autocracy, while others among them see in this clarification a, quote, compromise, evidently a compromise with the theory of, quote, economic struggle against the employers and the government, unquote. We urged the necessity of carrying the class struggle into the rural districts in connection with the 40th anniversary of the emancipation of the peasantry, and spoke of the irreconcilability of the local government bodies and the autocracy in relation to Witta's secret memorandum, number 4. In connection with the new law, we attacked the feudal landlords and the government which serves them, in issue number 8, and we welcomed the illegal Zemstvo Congress. We urged the Zemstvo to pass over from abject petitions, in issue 8, to struggle. We encouraged the students who had begun to understand the need for the political struggle and to undertake this struggle, in issue 3, while at the same time we lashed out at the, quote, outrageous incomprehension revealed by the adherents of the, quote, purely student movement, who called upon the peasants to abstain from participating in the street demonstrations, issue number 3, in connection with the manifesto issued by the Executive Committee of the Moscow Students on February 25. We exposed the, quote, senseless dreams and the, quote, lying hypocrisy of the cunning liberals of Russia, in issue 5, while pointing to the violent fury with which the government gaoler persecuted, quote, peaceful writers, aged professors, scientists, and well-known liberal Zemstvo members, unquote, issue 5, police raid on literature. We exposed the real significance of the program of, quote, state protection for the welfare of the workers, and welcomed the, quote, valuable admission that, quote, it is better by granting reforms from above to forestall the demand for such reforms from below than to wait for those demands to be put forward. Issue number 6. We encouraged the protesting statisticians in issue number 7 and censured the strike-breaking statisticians in issue number 9. He who sees in these tactics an obscuring of the class consciousness of the proletariat and a compromise with liberalism reveals his utter failure to understand the true significance of the program of the Credo and carries out that program de facto, however much he may repudiate it. For by such an approach, he drags social democracy towards the, quote, economic struggle against the employers and the government, and yields to liberalism, abandons the task of actively intervening in every, quote, liberal issue, and of determining his own social democratic attitude towards this question. Section 3.6, once more slanderers, once more mystifiers. These polite expressions, as the reader will recall, belong to Rabotchi-Odiello, which in this way answers our charge that it, quote, is indirectly preparing the ground for converting the working class movement into an instrument of bourgeois democracy, unquote. In its simplicity of heart, Rabotchi-Odiello decided that this accusation was nothing more than a polemical sally. These malicious doctrinaires are bent on saying all sorts of unpleasant things about us, and what can be more unpleasant than being an instrument of bourgeois democracy? And so they print in bold type a, quote, refutation, quote, nothing but downright slander, quote, mystification, quote, mummery, in 2 conferences. Like Jove, Rabotchi-Odiello, although bearing little resemblance to that deity, is wrathful because it is wrong, and proves by its hasty abuse that it is incapable of understanding its opponent's mode of reasoning. And yet, with only a little reflection, it would have understood why any subservience to the spontaneity of the mass movement and any degrading of social democratic politics to the level of trade unionist politics mean preparing the ground for converting the working class movement into an instrument of bourgeois democracy. The spontaneous working class movement is by itself able to create, and inevitably does create, only trade unionism, and the working class trade unionist politics is precisely working class bourgeois politics. The fact that the working class participates in the political struggle and even in the political revolution does not in itself make its politics social democratic politics. Will Rabotchi-Odiello make bold to deny this? Will it, at long last, publicly, plainly, and without equivocation, explain how it understands the urgent questions of international and of Russian social democracy? Hardly. It will never do anything of the kind because it holds fast to the trick, which might be described as the, quote, not here method. It's not me, it's not my horse, I'm not the driver. We are not economists. Rabotchi Missile does not stand for economism. There is no economism at all in Russia. This is a remarkably adroit and, quote, political trick, which suffers from the slight defect, however, that the publications practicing it are usually nicknamed, quote, at your service, sir. Rabotchi-Odiello imagines that bourgeois democracy in Russia is, in general, merely a, quote, phantom in 2 conferences. Happy people. Ostrich-like, they bury their heads in the sand and imagine that everything around has disappeared. Liberal publicists who month after month proclaim to the world their triumph over the collapse and even the disappearance of Marxism. Liberal newspapers, S. Peterburgskia Vedomosti, Ruskia Vedomosti, and many others, which encourage the liberals who bring to the workers the Brentano conception of the class struggle and the trade unionist conception of politics, the galaxy of critics of Marxism, whose real tendencies were so very well disclosed by the Credo and whose literary products alone circulate in Russia without let or hindrance, the revival of revolutionary non-social democratic tendencies, particularly after the February and March events. All these apparently are just phantoms. All these have nothing at all to do with bourgeois democracy. Rabotchi-Odiello and the authors of the Economist letter published in Iskra number 12 should, quote, ponder over the reason why the events of the spring brought about such a revival of revolutionary non-social democratic tendencies, instead of increasing the authority and the prestige of social democracy, unquote. The reason lies in the fact that we failed to cope with our tasks. The masses of the workers proved to be more active than we. We lacked adequately trained revolutionary leaders and organizers possessed of a thorough knowledge of the mood prevailing among all the opposition strata and able to head the movement, to turn a spontaneous demonstration into a political one, broaden its political character, etc. Under such circumstances, our backwardness will inevitably be utilized by the more mobile and more energetic non-social democratic revolutionaries. And the workers, however energetically and self-sacrificingly they may fight the police and the troops, however revolutionary their actions may be, will prove to be merely a force supporting those revolutionaries, the rear guard of bourgeois democracy, and not the social democratic vanguard. Let us take, for example, the German Social Democrats, whose weak aspects alone our economists desire to emulate. Why is there not a single political event in Germany that does not add to the authority and prestige of social democracy? Because social democracy is always found to be in advance of all others in furnishing the most revolutionary appraisal of every given event and in championing every protest against tyranny. It does not lull itself with arguments that the economic struggle brings the workers to realize that they have no political rights and that the concrete conditions unavoidably impel the working class movement on to the path of revolution. It intervenes in every sphere and in every question of social and political life. In the matter of Wilhelm's refusal to endorse a bourgeois progressist as city mayor, our economists have not managed to educate yet the Germans to the understanding that such an act is, in fact, a compromise with liberalism. In the matter of the law against, quote, obscene publications and pictures. In the matter of governmental influence on the election of professors, etc., etc. Everywhere the Social Democrats are found in the forefront, rousing political discontent among all masses, rousing the sluggards, stimulating the laggards, and providing a wealth of material for the development of the political consciousness and the political activity of the proletariat. As a result, even the avowed enemies of socialism are filled with respect for this advanced political fighter, and not infrequently an important document from bourgeois and even from bureaucratic and court circles makes its way by some miraculous means into the editorial office of Vorwärts. This then is the resolution of the seeming, quote, contradiction that surpasses Rabotchi Diello's powers of understanding to such an extent that it can only throw up its hands and cry, quote, mummery. Indeed, just think of it. We, Rabotchi Diello, regard the mass working class movement as the cornerstone, and say so in bold type. We warn all and sundry against belittling the significance of the element of spontaneity. We desire to lend the economic struggle itself a political character. We desire to maintain close and organic contact with the proletarian struggle. And yet we are told that we are preparing the ground for the conversion of the working class movement into an instrument of bourgeois democracy. And who are they that presume to say this? People who, quote, compromise with liberalism by intervening in every, quote, liberal issue? What a gross misunderstanding of, quote, organic contact with the proletarian struggle. By devoting so much attention to the students and even, oh horror, to the Zemstvos. People who in general wish to devote a greater percentage, compared with the economists, of their efforts to activity among non-proletarian classes of the population. What is this but, quote, mummery? Poor Rabotchi Diello, will it ever find the solution to this perplexing puzzle? Chapter 4. The primitiveness of the economists and the organization of the revolutionaries. Rabotchi Diello's assertions, which we have analyzed, that the economic struggle is the most widely applicable means of political agitation, and that our task now is to lend the economic struggle itself a political character, etc., express a narrow view not only of our political, but also of our organizational tasks. The, quote, economic struggle against the employers and the government does not at all require an all-Russia centralized organization, and hence this struggle can never give rise to such an organization as will combine, in one general assault, all the manifestations of political opposition, protest, and indignation, an organization that will consist of professional revolutionaries and be led by the real political leaders of the entire people. This stands to reason. The character of any organization is naturally and inevitably determined by the content of its activity. Consequently, Robochie Dielo, by the assertions analyzed above, sanctifies and legitimizes not only narrowness of political activity, but also of organizational work. In this case, Robochie Dielo, as always, proves itself an organ whose consciousness yields to spontaneity. Yet subservience to spontaneously developing forms of organization, failure to realize the narrowness and primitiveness of our organizational work, of our, quote, handicraft methods in this most important sphere, failure to realize this, I say, is a veritable ailment from which our movement suffers. It is not an ailment that comes with decline, but one, of course, that comes with growth. It is, however, at the present time, when the wave of spontaneous indignation, as it were, is sweeping over us, leaders and organizers of the movement, that an irreconcilable struggle must be waged against all defense of backwardness, against any legitimation of narrowness in this matter. It is particularly necessary to arouse in all who participate in practical work or are preparing to take up that work discontent with the amateurism prevailing among us and an unshakable determination to rid ourselves of it. 4.1. What is primitiveness? We shall try to answer this question by giving a brief description of the activity of a typical social democratic study circle of the period 1894 to 1901. We have noted that the entire student youth of the period was absorbed in Marxism. Of course, these students were not only, or even not so much, interested in Marxism as a theory, they were interested in it as an answer to the question, what is to be done, as a call to take the field against the enemy. These new warriors marched to battle with astonishingly primitive equipment and training. In a vast number of cases, they had almost no equipment and absolutely no training. They marched to war like peasants from the plow, armed only with clubs. A student circle establishes contacts with workers and sets to work without any connection to the old members of the movement, without any connection with study circles in other districts, or even in other parts of the same city, or in other educational institutions, without any organization of the various divisions of revolutionary work, without any systematic plan of activity covering any length of time. The circle gradually expands its propaganda and agitation. By its activities, it wins the sympathies of fairly large sections of workers and of a certain section of the educated strata, which provide it with money and from among whom the, quote, committee recruits new groups of young people. The attractive power of the committee, or League of Struggle, grows, its sphere of activity becomes wider, and the committee expands this activity quite spontaneously. The very people who a year or a few months previously spoke at the students' circle gatherings and discussed the question, whither, who established and maintained contacts with the workers and wrote and published leaflets, now establish contacts with other groups of revolutionaries, procure literature, set to work to publish a local newspaper, begin to talk of organizing a demonstration, and finally turn to open warfare, which may, according to circumstances, take the form of issuing the first agitational leaflet, or the first issue of a newspaper, or of organizing the first demonstration. Usually, the initiation of such actions ends in a complete and immediate fiasco. Immediate and complete because this open warfare was not the result of a systematic and carefully thought out and gradually prepared plan for a prolonged and stubborn struggle, but simply the result of the spontaneous growth of traditional study circle work, because, naturally, the police, in almost every case, knew the principal leaders of the local movement, since they had already, quote, gained a reputation for themselves in their student days, and the police waited only for the right moment to make their raid. They deliberately allowed the study circle sufficient time to develop its work so that they might obtain a palpable corpus delicti, and they always permitted several of the persons known to them to remain at liberty, quote, for breeding. which, as far as I know, is the technical term used both by our people and by the gendarmes. One cannot help comparing this kind of warfare with that conducted by a mass of peasants, armed with clubs, against modern troops. And one can only wonder at the vitality of the movement which expanded, grew, and scored victories despite the total lack of training on the part of the fighters. True, from the historical point of view, the primitiveness of equipment was not only inevitable at first, but even legitimate as one of the conditions for the wide recruiting of fighters. But as soon as serious war operations began, and they began in fact with the strikes in the summer of 1896, the defects in our fighting organizations made themselves felt to an ever-increasing degree. The government, at first thrown into confusion and committing a number of blunders, e.g. its appeal to the public, describing the misdeeds of the socialists or the banishment of workers from the capitals to provincial industrial centers, very soon adapted itself to the new conditions of the struggle and managed to deploy well its perfectly equipped detachments of agents provocateurs, spies, and gendarmes. Raids became so frequent, affected such a vast number of people, and cleared out the local study circles so thoroughly that the masses of the workers lost literally all their leaders. The movement assumed an amazingly sporadic character, and it became utterly impossible to establish continuity and coherence in the work. The terrible dispersion of the local leaders, the fortuitous character of the study circle memberships, the lack of training in, the narrow focus on theoretical, political, and organizational questions were all the inevitable result of the conditions described above. Things have reached such a pass that in several places the workers, because of our lack of self-restraint and the inability to maintain secrecy, begin to lose faith in the intellectuals and to avoid them. The intellectuals, they say, are much too careless and cause police raids. Anyone who has the slightest knowledge of the movement is aware that all thinking social democrats have at last begun to regard these amateurs' methods as a disease. In order that the reader who is not acquainted with the movement may have no grounds for thinking that we are, quote, inventing a special stage or special disease of the movement, we shall refer once again to the witness we have quoted. We trust we shall be forgiven for the length of this passage. Quote, while the gradual transition to more extensive practical activity, writes B.V. in Robotchia Dielo number 6, a transition that is directly dependent on the general transitional period through which the Russian working class movement is now passing, is a characteristic feature. There is, however, another, no less interesting feature in the general mechanism of the Russian workers' revolution. We refer to the general lack of revolutionary forces fit for action, which is felt not only in St. Petersburg, but throughout Russia. With the general revival of the working class movement, with the general development of the working masses, with the growing frequency of strikes, with the increasingly open mass struggle of the workers, and with the intensified government persecution, arrests, deportation, and exile, this lack of highly skilled revolutionary forces is becoming more and more marked, and without a doubt cannot but affect the depth and the general character of the movement. Many strikes take place without any strong and direct influence upon them by the revolutionary organizations. A shortage of agitational leaflets and illegal literature is felt. The workers' study circles are left without agitators. In addition, there is a constant dearth of funds. In a word, the growth of the working class movement is outstripping the growth and development of the revolutionary organizations. The numerical strength of the active revolutionaries is too small to enable them to concentrate in their own hands the influence exercised upon the whole mass of discontented workers, or to give this discontent even a shadow of coherence and organization. The separate study circles, the separate revolutionaries, scattered, uncombined, do not represent a single strong and disciplined organization with proportionately developed parts, unquote. Admitting that the immediate organization of fresh study circles to replace those that have been broken up merely proves the vitality of the movement, but does not prove the existence of an adequate number of adequately prepared revolutionary workers. The author concludes, quote, the lack of practical training among the St. Petersburg revolutionaries is seen in the results of their work. The recent trials, especially that of the Self-Emancipation Group and the Labor Against Capital Group, clearly showed that the young agitator, lacking a detailed knowledge of working class conditions and, consequently, of the conditions under which agitation can be carried on in a given factory, ignorant of the principles of secrecy, and understanding only the general principles of social democracy, if he does, is able to carry on his work for perhaps 4, 5, or 6 months. Then come arrests, which frequently lead to the breakup of the entire organization, or at all events, of part of it. The question arises, therefore, can the group conduct successful activity if its existence is measured by months? Obviously, the defects of the existing organizations cannot be wholly ascribed to the transitional period. Obviously, the numerical and above all the qualitative makeup of the functioning organizations is no small factor. And the first task our Social Democrats must undertake is that of effectively combining the organizations and making a strict selection of their membership, unquote. Section 4.2, Primitiveness and Economism. We must now deal with a question that has undoubtedly come to the mind of every reader. Can a connection be established between primitiveness as growing pains that affect the whole movement and economism, which is one of the currents in Russian social democracy? We think that it can. Lack of practical training, of ability to carry on organizational work, is certainly common to us all, including those who have from the very outset unswervingly stood for revolutionary Marxism. Of course, were it only lack of practical training, no one could blame the practical workers. But the term primitiveness embraces something more than lack of training. It denotes a narrow scope of revolutionary work generally, failure to understand that a good organization of revolutionaries cannot be built on the basis of such narrow activity. And lastly, and this is the main thing, attempts to justify this narrowness and to elevate it to a special, quote, theory, i.e. subservience to spontaneity on this question too. Once such attempts were revealed, it became clear that primitiveness is connected with economism, and that we shall never rid ourselves of this narrowness of our organizational activity until we rid ourselves of economism generally, i.e. the narrow conception of Marxist theory, as well as the role of social democracy and of its political tasks. These attempts manifested themselves in a twofold direction. Some began to say that the working masses themselves have not yet advanced the broad and militant political tasks which the revolutionaries are attempting to, quote, impose on them, that they must continue to struggle for immediate political demands to conduct, quote, the economic struggle against the employers and the government, unquote, and naturally corresponding to this struggle, which is, quote, accessible to the mass movement, there must be an organization that will be, quote, accessible to the most untrained youth. Others, far removed from any theory of, quote, gradualness, said that it is possible and necessary to, quote, bring about a political revolution, but that this does not require building a strong organization of revolutionaries to train the proletariat in steadfast and stubborn struggle. All we need do is to snatch up our old friend, the, quote, accessible cudgel. To drop metaphor, it means that we must organize a general strike, or that we must stimulate the, quote, spiritless progress of the working class movement by means of, quote, excitative terror. Both these trends, the opportunists and the, quote, revolutionists, bow to the prevailing amateurism. Neither believes that it can be eliminated. Neither understands our primary and imperative practical task to establish an organization of revolutionaries capable of lending energy, stability, and continuity to the political struggle. We have quoted the words of BV, quote, the growth of the working class movement is outstripping the growth and development of the revolutionary organizations. This, quote, valuable remark of a close observer, Raboccia Diello's comment on BV's article, has a twofold value for us. It shows that we were right in our opinion that the principal cause of the present crisis in Russian social democracy is the lag of the leaders, quote, ideologists, revolutionaries, social democrats, behind the spontaneous upsurge of the masses. It shows that all the arguments advanced by the authors of the Economist letter in Iskra number 12, by Khrushchevsky and by Martynov, as to the danger of belittling the significance of the spontaneous element, of the drab everyday struggle, as to tactics as progress, etc., are nothing more than a glorification and a defense of primitiveness. These people, who cannot pronounce the word theoretician without a sneer, who describe their genuflections to common lack of training and backwardness as a, quote, sense for the realities of life, reveal in practice a failure to understand our most imperative practical tasks. To laggards they shout, keep in step, don't run ahead. To people suffering from a lack of energy and initiative in organizational work, from a lack of, quote, plans for wide and bold activity, they prate about, quote, tactics as process. The worst sin we commit is that we degrade our political and organizational tasks to the level of the immediate, quote, palpable, quote, concrete interests of the everyday economic struggle. Yet they keep singing to us the same refrain, lend the economic struggle itself a political character. We repeat, this kind of thing displays as much, quote, sense for the realities of life as was displayed by the hero in the popular fable, who cried out to a passing funeral procession, many happy returns of the day. Recall the matchless, truly Narcissus-like superciliousness with which these wiseacres lectured Plekhanov on the, quote, workers' circles generally, being, quote, unable to cope with political tasks in the real and practical sense of the word, i.e., in the sense of the expedient and successful practical struggle for political demands. Rabotchi-Diello's reply. There are circles and circles, gentlemen. Circles of, quote, amateurs are not, of course, capable of coping with political tasks so long as they have not become aware of their amateurism and do not abandon it. If, besides this, these amateurs are enamored of their primitive methods and insist on writing the word practical in italics, and imagine that being practical demands that one's tasks must be reduced to the level of understanding of the most backward strata of the masses, then they are hopeless amateurs and, of course, certainly cannot, in general, cope with any political tasks. But a circle of leaders, of the type of Alexiev and Mishkin, of Kalturin and Zelyabov, is capable of coping with political tasks in the genuine and most practical sense of the term, for the reason and to the extent that their impassioned propaganda meets with response among the spontaneously awakened masses, and their sparkling energy is answered and supported by the energy of the revolutionary class. Plekhanov was profoundly right, not only in pointing to this revolutionary class and proving that its spontaneous awakening was inevitable, but in setting even the, quote, workers' circles a great and lofty political task. But you refer to the mass movement that has sprung up since that time in order to degrade this task, to curtail the energy and scope of activity of the, quote, workers' circles. If you are not amateurs enamored of your own primitive methods, what are you then? You boast that you are practical, but you fail to see what every Russian practical worker knows, namely, the miracles that the energy, not only of a circle, but even of an individual person, is able to perform in the revolutionary cause. Or do you think that our movement cannot produce leaders like those of the 70s? If so, why do you think so? Because we lack training? But we are training ourselves. We will go on training ourselves, and we will be trained. Unfortunately, it is true that the surface of the stagnant waters of the, quote, economic struggle against the employers and the government is overgrown with fungus. People have appeared among us who kneel in prayer to spontaneity, gazing with awe, to take an expression from Plekhanov, upon the, quote, posterior of the Russian proletariat. But we will get rid of this fungus. The time has come when Russian revolutionaries, guided by a genuinely revolutionary theory, relying upon the genuinely revolutionary and spontaneously awakening class, can at long last, rise in full stature in all their giant strength. All that is required for the masses of our practical workers, and the still larger masses of those who dreamed of practical work when they were still at school, to pour scorn and ridicule upon any suggestion that may be made to degrade our political tasks and to restrict the scope of our organizational work. And we will achieve that, rest assured, gentlemen. In the article Where to Begin, I wrote in opposition to Rabotchi-Diello, quote, the tactics of agitation in relation to some special question, or the tactics with regard to some detail of party organization, may be changed in 24 hours, but only people devoid of all principle are capable of changing in 24 hours, or for that matter, in 24 months, their view on the necessity, in general, constantly, and absolutely, of an organization of struggle and of political agitation among the masses, unquote. To this, Rabotchi Diallo replied, quote, "This, the only one of Iskra's charges that makes a pretense of being based on facts, is totally without foundation. Readers of Rabotchi Diallo know very well that from the outset we not only called for political agitation without waiting for the appearance of Iskra, saying at the same time that not only the workers' study circles, quote, but also the mass working class movement could not regard as its first political task the overthrow of absolutism, unquote, but only the struggle for immediate political demands, and that, quote, the masses begin to understand immediate political demands after one, or at all events, after several strikes," unquote. But that with our publications, which we furnished from abroad for the comrades working in Russia, we provided the only social democratic political and agitational material. And in this sole material, you not only based the widest political agitation exclusively on the economic struggle, but you even went to the extent of claiming that this restricted agitation was the, quote, most widely applicable. And you do not observe, gentlemen, that your own argument, that this was the only material provided, proves the necessity for Iskra's appearance and its struggle against Rabotchi Diallo. On the other hand, our publishing activity actually prepared the ground for the tactical unity of the party, unity in the conviction that tactics is a process of growth of party tasks that grow together with the party, a precious unity indeed, and by that rendered possible the creation of a militant organization for which the Union abroad did all that an organization abroad could do, unquote, Rabotchi Diallo, number 10. A vain attempt at evasion. I would never dream of denying that you did all you possibly could. I have asserted, and assert now, that the limits of what is, quote, possible for you to do are restricted by the narrowness of your outlook. It is ridiculous to talk of a, quote, militant organization to fight for, quote, immediate political demands, or to conduct the economic struggle against the employers and the government. But if the reader wishes to see the pearls of economist infatuation with amateurism, he must, of course, turn from the eclectic and vacillating Rabotchi Diallo to the consistent and determined Rabotchi Missal. In its separate supplement, Rabotchi Missal wrote, quote, now 2 words about the so-called revolutionary intelligentsia proper. True, on more than one occasion it has proved itself prepared to enter into every determined battle with Tsarism. The unfortunate thing, however, is that our revolutionary intelligentsia, ruthlessly persecuted by the political police, imagined the struggle against the political police to be the political struggle against the autocracy. That is why, to this day, it cannot understand, quote, where the forces for the struggle against the autocracy are to be obtained, unquote. Truly matchless is the lofty contempt for the struggle against the police displayed by this worshipper, in the worst sense of the word, of the spontaneous movement. He is prepared to justify our inability to organize secret activity by the argument that with the spontaneous mass movement, it is not at all important for us to struggle against the political police. Very few people indeed would subscribe to this appalling conclusion. To such an extent have our deficiencies in revolutionary organizations become a matter of acute importance. But if Martynov, for example, refuses to subscribe to this, it will only be because he is unable or lacks the courage to think out his ideas to their logical conclusion. Indeed, does the task of advancing concrete demands by the masses, demands that promise palpable results, call for special efforts to create a stable, centralized, militant organization of revolutionaries? Cannot such a task be carried out even by masses that do not, quote, struggle against the political police at all? Could this task, moreover, be fulfilled if, in addition to the few leaders, it were not undertaken by such workers, the overwhelming majority, as are quite incapable of, quote, struggling against the political police? Such workers, average people of the masses, are capable of displaying enormous energy and self-sacrifice in strikes and in street battles with the police and the troops, and are capable, in fact are alone capable, of determining the outcome of our entire movement but the struggle against the political police requires special qualities. It requires professional revolutionaries. And we must see to it not only that the masses, quote, advance such concrete demands, but that the masses of the workers advance an increasing number of such professional revolutionaries. Thus, we have reached the question of the relation between an organization of professional revolutionaries and the labor movement, pure and simple. Although this question has found little reflection in literature, it has greatly engaged us, quote, politicians in conversations and polemics with comrades who gravitate more or less towards economism. It is a question meriting special treatment. But before taking it up, let us offer one further quotation by way of illustrating our thesis on the connection between primitiveness and economism. In his reply, Mr. N.N. wrote, quote, "The emancipation of labor group demands direct struggle against the government without first considering where the material forces for this struggle are to be obtained and without indicating the path of the struggle," unquote. Emphasizing the last words, the author adds the following footnote to the word path, quote, "This cannot be explained by purposes of secrecy because the program does not refer to a plot but to a mass movement, and the masses cannot proceed by secret paths. Can we conceive of a secret strike? Can we conceive of secret demonstrations and petitions?" Thus, the author comes quite close to the question of the, quote, material forces, organizers of strikes and demonstrations, and to the paths of the struggle, but nevertheless is still in a state of consternation because he, quote, worships the mass movement, i.e., he regards it as something that relieves us of the necessity of conducting revolutionary activity and not as something that should encourage us and stimulate our revolutionary activity. It is impossible for a strike to remain a secret to those participating in it and to those immediately associated with it, but it may, and in the majority of cases does, remain a secret to the masses of the Russian workers because the government takes care to cut all communication with the strikers, to prevent all news of strikes from spreading. Here indeed is where a special struggle against the political police is required, a struggle that can never be conducted actively by such large masses as take part in strikes. This struggle must be organized according to, quote, all the rules of the art, by people who are professionally engaged in revolutionary activity. The fact that the masses are spontaneously being drawn into the movement does not make the organization of the struggle less necessary. On the contrary, it makes it more necessary, for we socialists would be failing in our direct duty to the masses if we did not prevent the police from making a secret of every strike and every demonstration, and if we did not ourselves from time to time secretly prepare strikes and demonstrations. And we will succeed in doing this, because the spontaneously awakening masses will also produce increasing numbers of professional revolutionaries from their own ranks. That is, if we do not take it into our heads to advise the workers to keep on marking time. Section 4.3, Organization of Workers and Organization of Revolutionaries. It is only natural to expect that for a social democrat whose conception of the political struggle coincides with the conception of the, quote, economic struggle against the employers and the government, the, quote, organization of revolutionaries will more or less coincide with the, quote, organization of workers. This is, in fact, what actually happens, so that when we speak of organization, we literally speak in different tongues. I vividly recall, for example, a conversation I once had with a fairly consistent economist, with whom I had not been previously acquainted. We were discussing the pamphlet, Who Will Bring About the Political Revolution, and were soon of a mind that its principal defect was its ignoring of the question of organization. We had begun to assume full agreement between us, but as the conversation proceeded, it became evident that we were talking about different things. My interlocutor accused the author of ignoring strike funds, mutual benefit societies, etc., whereas I had in mind an organization of revolutionaries as an essential factor in, quote, bringing about the political revolution. As soon as the disagreement became clear, there was hardly, as I remember, a single question of principle upon which I was in agreement with the economist. So what was the source of our disagreement? It was the fact that on questions both of organization and of politics, the economists are forever lapsing from social democracy into trade unionism. The political struggle of social democracy is far more extensive and complex than the economic struggle of the workers against the employers and the government. Similarly, indeed for that reason, the organization of the Revolutionary Social Democratic Party must inevitably be of a kind different from the organization of the workers designed for this struggle. The workers' organization must be, in the first place, a trade union organization. Secondly, it must be as broad as possible. And thirdly, it must be as public as conditions will allow. Here, and further on, of course, I refer only to absolutist Russia. On the other hand, the organization of the revolutionaries must consist, first and foremost, of people who make revolutionary activity their profession, for which reason I speak of the organization of revolutionaries, meaning revolutionary social democrats. In view of this common characteristic of the members of such an organization, all distinctions as between workers and intellectuals, not to speak of distinctions of trade and profession in both categories, must be effaced. Such an organization must perforce not be very extensive and must be as secret as possible. Let us examine this threefold distinction. In countries where political liberty exists, the distinction between a trade union and a political organization is clear enough, as is the distinction between trade unions and social democracy. The relations between the latter and the former will naturally vary in each country according to historical, legal, and other conditions. They may be more or less close, complex, etc. In our opinion, they should be as close and as little complicated as possible. But there can be no question in free countries of the organization of trade unions coinciding with the organizations of the Social Democratic Party. In Russia, however, the yoke of the autocracy appears at first glance to obliterate all distinctions between the Social Democratic organization and the workers' associations, since all workers' associations and all study circles are prohibited, and since the principal manifestation and weapon of the workers' economic struggle, the strike, is regarded as a criminal and sometimes even as a political offense. Conditions in our country, therefore, on the one hand, strongly, quote, impel the workers engaged in economic struggle to concern themselves with political questions, and on the other, they, quote, impel the Social Democrats to confound trade unionism with social democracy. And our Khrushchevskys, Martinovs, and co., while diligently discussing the first kind of, quote, impulsion, failed to notice the second. Indeed, picture to yourselves people who are immersed 99% in, quote, the economic struggle against the employers and the government. Some of them will never, during the entire course of their activity, from 4 to 6 months, be impelled to think of the need for a more complex organization of revolutionaries. Others, perhaps, will come across the fairly widely distributed Bernsteinian literature, from which they will become convinced of the profound importance of the forward movement of, quote, the drab everyday struggle. Still others will be carried away, perhaps, by the seductive idea of showing the world a new example of, quote, close and organic contact with the proletarian struggle, unquote, contact between the trade union and the social democratic movements. Such people may argue that the later a country enters the arena of capitalism and consequently of the working class movement, the more the socialists in that country may take part in and support the trade union movement, and the less the reason for the existence of non-social democratic trade unions. So far, the argument is fully correct. However, unfortunately, some go beyond that and dream of a complete fusion of social democracy with trade unionism. We shall soon see from the example of the rules of the St. Petersburg League of Struggle what a harmful effect such dreams have upon our plans of organization. The workers' organizations for the economic struggle should be trade union organizations. Every social democratic worker should, as far as possible, assist and actively work in these organizations. But while this is true, it is certainly not in our interest to demand that only social democrats should be eligible for membership in the, quote, trade unions, since that would only narrow the scope of our influence upon the masses. Let every worker who understands the need to unite for the struggle against the employers and the government join the trade unions. The very aim of the trade unions would be impossible of achievement if they did not unite all who have attained at least this elementary degree of understanding, if they were not very broad organizations. The broader these organizations, the broader will be our influence over them, and influence due not only to the, quote, spontaneous, development of the economic struggle, but to the direct and conscious effort of the socialist trade union members to influence their comrades. But a broad organization cannot apply methods of strict secrecy, since this demands far greater training than is required for the economic struggle. How is the contradiction between the need for a large membership and the need for strictly secret methods to be reconciled? How are we to make the trade unions as public as possible? Generally speaking, there can be only two ways to this end. Either the trade unions must become legalized. In some countries, this preceded the legalization of the socialist and political unions, or the organization is kept secret, but so, quote, free and amorphous, loose, as the Germans say, that the need for secret methods becomes almost negligible as far as the bulk of the members is concerned. The legalization of non-socialist and non-political labor unions in Russia has begun, and there is no doubt that every advance made by our rapidly growing social democratic working class movement will multiply and encourage attempts at legalization, attempts proceeding, for the most part, from supporters of the existing order, but partly also from the workers themselves and from liberal intellectuals. The banner of legality has already been hoisted by the Vasilyevs and the Zubatovs. Support has been promised and rendered by the Ozorovs and the Wormses, and followers of the new tendency are now to be found among the workers. Henceforth, we cannot but reckon with this tendency. How are we to reckon with it? On this there can be no two opinions among social democrats. We must steadfastly expose any part played in this movement by the Zubatovs and the Vasilyevs, the gendarmes and the priests, and explain their real intentions to the workers. We must also expose all the conciliatory, quote, harmonious notes that will be heard in the speeches of liberal politicians at legal meetings of the workers, irrespective of whether the speeches are motivated by an earnest conviction of the desirability of peaceful class collaboration, by a desire to curry favor with the powers that be, or whether they are simply the result of clumsiness. Lastly, we must warn the workers against the traps often set by the police, who at such open meetings and permitted societies spy out the, quote, fiery ones and try to make use of legal organizations to plant their agents provocateurs in the illegal organizations. Doing all this does not at all mean forgetting that in the long run, the legalization of the working class movement will be to our advantage and not to that of the Zubatovs. On the contrary, it is precisely our campaign of exposure that will help us to separate the tares from the wheat. What the tares are, we have already indicated. By the wheat, we mean attracting the attention of ever larger numbers, including the most backward sections of the workers, to social and political questions, and freeing ourselves, the revolutionaries, from functions that are essentially legal, the distribution of legal books, mutual aid, etc., the development of which will inevitably provide us with an increasing quantity of material for agitation. In this sense, we may, and should, say to the Zubatovs and the Ozorovs, keep at it, gentlemen, do your best. Whenever you place a trap in the path of the workers, either by way of direct provocation or by the, quote, honest demoralization of the workers with the aid of Struvism, we will see to it that you are exposed. But whenever you take a real step forward, though it may be the most timid zigzag, we will say, please continue. And the only step that can be a real step forward is a real, if small, extension of the workers' field of action. Every such extension will be to our advantage and will help to hasten the advent of legal societies of the kind in which it will not be agents provocateurs who are detecting socialists, but socialists who are gaining adherents. In a word, our task is to fight the tares. It is not our business to grow wheat in flower pots. By pulling up the tares, we clear the soil for the wheat. And while the Afanasy Ivanoviches and Pulcheria Ivanovnas are tending their flower pot crops, we must prepare the reapers, not only to cut down the tares of today, but to reap the wheat of tomorrow. Thus, we cannot, by means of legalization, solve the problem of creating a trade union organization that will be as little secret and as extensive as possible. But we should be extremely glad if the Zubatovs and the Ozorovs disclosed to us even a partial opportunity for such a solution. To this end, however, we must strenuously combat them. There remain secret trade union organizations, and we must give all possible assistance to the workers who, as we definitely know, are adopting this course. Trade union organizations not only can be of tremendous value in developing and consolidating the economic struggle, but can also become a very important auxiliary to political agitation and revolutionary organization. In order to achieve this purpose, and in order to guide the nascent trade union movement in the channels desired by social democracy, we must first understand clearly the absurdity of the plan of organization the St. Petersburg economists have been nursing for nearly 5 years. That plan is set forth in the Rules for a Workers' Mutual Benefit Fund of July 1897, taken from Robochia Missal number 1, as well as in the Rules for a Trade Union Workers' Organization of October 1900, Iskra issue number 1. Both these sets of rules have one main shortcoming. They set up the broad workers' organization in a rigidly specified structure and confound it with the organization of revolutionaries. Let us take the last mentioned set of rules since it is drawn up in greater detail. The body consists of 52 paragraphs. 23 deal with the structure, the method of functioning, and the competence of the, quote, worker circles, which are to be organized in every factory, quote, a maximum of 10 persons, and which elect, quote, central factory groups. The central group, says paragraph 2, quote, observes that all that goes on in its factory or workshop and keeps a record of events. The central group presents to subscribers a monthly financial account, etc., unquote. 10 paragraphs are devoted to the, quote, district organization, and 19 to the highly complex interconnection between the Committee of the Workers' Organization and the Committee of the St. Petersburg League of Struggle, elected representatives of each district and of the, quote, executive groups, quote, groups of propagandists, groups for maintaining contact with the provinces, and with the organization abroad, groups for managing stores, publications, and funds, unquote. Social democracy equals executive groups in relation to the economic struggle of the workers. It would be difficult to show more glaringly how the economists' ideas deviate from social democracy to trade unionism, and how alien to them is any idea that a social democrat must concern himself first and foremost with an organization of revolutionaries capable of guiding the entire proletarian struggle for emancipation. To talk of, quote, the political emancipation of the working class, unquote, and of the struggle against, quote, czarist despotism, and at the same time to draft rules like these, means to have no idea whatsoever of the real political tasks of social democracy. Not one of the 50 or so paragraphs reveals even a glimmer of understanding that it is necessary to conduct the widest possible political agitation among the masses, an agitation highlighting every aspect of Russian absolutism and the specific features of the various social classes in Russia. Rules like these are of no use even for the achievement of trade union, let alone political aims, since trade unions are organized by trades of which no mention is made. But most characteristic, perhaps, is the amazing top-heaviness of the whole system, which attempts to bind each single factory and its committee by a permanent string of uniform and ludicrously petty rules and a 3-stage system of election, hemmed in by the narrow